this country made in the event of a nuclear attack. I mean, it is that serious. It is that serious in their minds that they have implemented the plans that would go into effect had there been a nuclear explosion, a terrorist nuclear explosion, or an attack by a foreign nation on this country. That means essentially that that you could see the military become involved in keeping a hold on things here in the nation's capital. We certainly haven't had that. Don't want to suggest that that's going to happen. But these are items that are being discussed. Specifically, where does the president go to continue his chain of command, his position in the chain of command? We've already heard now that some members of Congress have been relocated. In the past, that would have been to a location in West Virginia. I don't think that's the case any longer. There are secure places, though, outside the Capitol that presumably are being used. In terms of what the FBI has picked up on thus far, to repeat, they believe that there were at least 4 hijackings of commercial aircraft. An American Airlines flight out of Boston, a United flight out of Dulles, an American flight out of Dulles, and a United flight out of Newark. The flight out of Newark is the one that is believed to have gone down in the vicinity, not directly owned, but in the vicinity of Camp David. 2 of the others, Dan, are believed to have struck the World Trade Center there in New York. It is still unclear to the FBI precisely what they're dealing with there at the Pentagon. David Martin, of course, is on the scene and has reported of the casualties and the obvious damage to the building. Collaterally, I'm told, that is impacted on the Pentagon's communications ability, and right now the command center, if you will, for the nation's response to this attack is being run out of FBI headquarters at 10th and Pennsylvania. That building has not been evacuated. Justice Department across the street has been. Already, I would tell you that national security experts on Capitol Hill and those who advise the chain of command of this nation are talking of how do we retaliate. But the question is, retaliate against who? It is entirely too early to say who is responsible for this. That hopefully will sort itself out in the time to come. I will tell you, though, it is openly being speculated on in the United States security apparatus that Osama bin Laden is the only person who had the apparatus, the money, and the desire to pull off what he did. They are also pointing, Dan, as we said earlier, at the coincidence here of this date. And dates are extremely important in the terrorist world. Sometimes they escape the notice of American intelligence. Obviously, this one did. We've been caught flat-footed, in the words of one senior official. But September the 11th, 1978 was the signing of the Camp David Accords, which has long been a matter of dispute and notation in the Islamic world. There is also a recognition among federal law enforcement officials that the attack on the World Trade Center is something that had to be expected, in the sense that it is the only target that Osama bin Laden and his organization have said would be a primary target in the United States. It's the symbol of this nation, and it was, of course, in 1993 that it was attacked, Dan.
Jim Stewart in Washington. Dateline, New York, a police official speaking on condition of anonymity says that the number of Trade Center casualties still unknown could be, quote, in the thousands. In the thousands. No one at this time should be particularly surprised by that, keeping in mind that incredibly, almost unbelievably, almost inconceivably, the twin towers, both towers of the World Trade Center, collapsed this morning, one shortly after the other. And having said that 50,000 people on your average day work in those towers, it should come as no surprise that a police official says that the number of Trade Center casualties still unknown could be, I want to mark that word, could be, quote, in the thousands, unquote. As we said earlier, unquestionably, many lives have been lost in this attack. Many lives have also been saved. It may be the rest of the day, even longer, before we have a clear picture of how many people were killed, how many were injured, were any police or firemen in their desperate efforts to save people, were any of their lives lost? We simply don't know, and we may not know for a long while. Now, Dateline Fort Worth, Texas American Airlines confirmed today that it lost 2 aircraft in the tragic incidents of this morning. The flights were Flight 11, a Boeing 767 en route from Boston to Los Angeles with 81 passengers, 9 flight attendants, and 2 pilots. That's one of the planes that crashed into the World Trade Center. It had 81 passengers, 9 flight attendants, and 2 pilots on board. And then American says Flight 77, a Boeing 757, the other was a 767, operating from Washington Dulles to Los Angeles with 58 passengers, 4 flight attendants, and 2 pilots, were lost in incidents this morning. Now, because of the heightened security due to the nature of today's events, American said it is working closely with government authorities and will not release any more information at this time. However, if you are a customer of American Airlines and you wish to receive information about relatives, you should call American's response number at 1-800-245-0999. 1-800-245-0999 for information on these 2 American Airlines planes that have been involved in tragedy this morning. Russ Mitchell has late word on what's happening in and around Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and in Pennsylvania.
That's right, Dan. Earlier this morning, we told you about a plane crash near Pittsburgh, just north of the Somerset County Airport. Another plane that was hijacked today was United Flight 93, which was traveling from Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco. United Airlines has just confirmed that flight is the one that crashed outside of Pittsburgh this morning. As of this moment, we don't know how many folks were on board, don't have any idea of casualties or fatalities. We'll get that for you in just a bit. But again, United Airlines has confirmed that yet another plane that was hijacked this morning has crashed, this one just outside of Pittsburgh near the Somerset County Airport.
And some of the monuments and principal buildings in Philadelphia, we were told earlier, had been shut down as a security measure.
That is right. Those shut down about 2 hours ago, and they are expected to be closed the remainder of the day.
We go to John Roberts in Washington. John?
Well, Dan, the Secret Service, as you can imagine, has activated its emergency plan. It's a plan that has been activated in stages prior to today's numerous events. One time that it was activated was when that small plane crashed on the south lawn of the White House. At about 9:40 this morning, the Vice President was evacuated from his office at the White House. Destination unknown. This is being kept very tightly under wraps at this point. The President, who was in Sarasota, Florida this morning for an educational event, also en route to destination unknown. But CBS happens to be traveling in the tight pool with the President today. We have one of our camera crews and one of our producers aboard Air Force One, and I'm certain that just as soon as the administration allows them to disclose whatever location they may be traveling to, we, as the other networks will hear from them in a prompt fashion. What we know at this point, Dan, is that the White House has been evacuated, as has the old executive office building, and a cordon of about 2 blocks has been set up around that building. There was obviously an imminent threat after this other explosion at the Pentagon earlier this morning. As to whether or not the White House itself was specifically targeted, no one will say. And again, the location of the President at present and where he is headed, and the Vice President and where he may be, being kept very tightly under wraps. But we do understand, Dan, from talking with sources close to security that provides protection for the President, that they are not likely to be headed to Weather Mountain. That is that highly secretive facility in the Blue Ridge Mountains in the western part of Virginia, which is essentially a hollowed-out piece of granite, which there are contingency plans to take officers of the administration, the President, the Vice President, his staff and the Cabinet, and the leadership of Congress to in the event of an all-out attack on the United States. We understand that they will not activate Weather Mountain. That's a direction that it appears that they're not headed in at this point. The President could go to any military base across the country. There are also a number of other facilities in which there are secure communications that the President could operate from, one of those being Camp David. Now, there had been earlier reports of some sort of a crash or an explosion near Camp David. Sources close to protection for the President told me this morning, Dan, just a little while ago, that they have not had any reports of that, though, as you can imagine, because of the extent of the carnage and the attacks against America this morning. It's difficult to know exactly what is going on at any particular point in time. Certainly, we will be hearing from the President later on when communications are reestablished, But for the moment now, Dan, what they're trying to do is make sure that the administration is in place to respond to this crisis, to ensure that the reins of government do not get broken, to ensure that they have communication with the leadership in Congress as well as the military. Those plans are in place right now. The president en route to a location where he can be assured of secure communications and contact with all of the officers that he needs to be in touch with. And again, Dan, we should be hearing from our people just as soon as they take the wraps off of this exactly where they are and what the immediate plan is. Dan?
John Robertson, Washington, of course, is concerned about how the government operates in Washington, but make no mistake, the center of this story today, these terrorist attacks, is at the tip of Manhattan, where the World Trade Centers, both of the Twin Towers, 110 stories up, both have collapsed. No one is making light of what's happened in Washington. Something happened at the Pentagon. An aircraft crashed at or right into the Pentagon, unclear exactly where, unclear whether anybody was killed. Some people were hurt at the Pentagon. An early report from a government official that a car bomb exploded outside the State Department was later denied by the Federal Securities Operation. That the FBI, an FBI official told Jim Stewart that a plane crashed near Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland. But now there's some question as to what all that was about. As one would expect in the early hours, there is confusion about the facts. But a known fact is that there's been a terrible loss of life. How much, no one knows. The mayor of New York says a tremendous loss of life. A New York City police official who didn't want to be quoted said that he thought that the loss of life in the World Trade Center collapse. You're looking at a live picture of it now with the Empire State Building in the foreground and the smoke over the Hudson and the great New York harbor, smoke in the nostrils of the Statue of Liberty, literally. That the loss of life here may be, according to the police official, in the many thousands, unquote, but that is not known. Now, authorities are on the alert from coast to coast, halting all air traffic, evacuating high-profile buildings, and tightening security at strategic facilities following these attacks on the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon. 4 airplanes are now confirmed to have been hijacked this morning. Whether it was one of those hijacked planes that hit the Pentagon, this is a live picture of the Pentagon, the first attack in the history of the United States Defense Department since it moved into this huge, sprawling Pentagon building in Washington. As you can see, there's considerable smoke, which may or may not indicate considerable damage at the Pentagon. Now, evacuations have been ordered at the United Nations building here in New York. This happened shortly after the 2 planes hit the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, and an aircraft of some sort crashed right into the Pentagon, or if not right into it, very near it. The Sears Tower in Chicago has been evacuated. The tallest skyscrapers in Boston, Cleveland, Minneapolis have been evacuated. Seattle's landmark Space Needle was closed. In Massachusetts and Maine, most state employees were sent home and state buildings were shut down. Military bases across the country have been placed on alert. Extra security went into place at the Department of Energy's Nuclear Weapons and Research Complex in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, and at Fort Detrick in Frederick, Maryland, home to the Army's main germ warfare defense laboratory. All of this happening as we face the fact, a brutal fact, that there has been a catastrophically effective attack on the World Trade Centers and additional attacks on the Pentagon in Washington, and possibly, reportedly, and we believe through an effort to attack Camp David in Maryland. I'm pausing for just a second as we get some new information in. However, that's not been totally confirmed, so I'll put it aside for the moment. 4 commercial airlines hijacked and crashed. 2 of those were American Airlines planes. Now, these are the flights that have been confirmed as hijacked flights this morning. American Airlines Flight 77, Dulles to Los Angeles. American Flight 11, Boston to Los Angeles. This, American says, is one of the planes that crashed into one of the World Trade Center buildings. United Flight 175 Dulles to Los Angeles was hijacked. United Flight 93 Newark to San Francisco was hijacked. Those are the flights. If you have questions about this and you need to contact one of the airlines about if you're concerned about passengers on these flights. This now back to live picture. Police say casualties could number in the thousands. Let us take you back now. We're going to show you on videotape the key sequence of events. This, again, is not a graphic. This is an actual photograph of the plane crashing into one of the World Trade Center towers. Flames shoot out of the opposite side of the building. And then, a short while later, one of the towers began collapsing. The hope, the prayer was it was only part of the building collapsing, but it turned out to be the whole building comes down. Raining debris in a wide area below it. And this harsh fact we had only had time to absorb it when the second tower began to collapse. First one plane hit a World Trade Center tower, then another plane hit the other tower. One tower collapses and the other collapses. Carol Marin, our CBS News correspondent based in Chicago, is just back from this part of New York City. Carol?
Dan, I think I was in the second collapse or an explosion right after that, because I was trying to make my way around Stuyvesant High School. I believe that's correct. I'm not a New Yorker. But I was coming toward the World Trade Center looking for CBS crews and asked a firefighter if he saw any. He told me to walk down the middle of the road. All of a sudden, there was a roll, an explosion, and we could see coming at us a ball of flame stories high. He and others screamed, "Run," and I ran. I fell. One of them picked me up. We ran as fast as we could, and then he threw me into the wall of a building and covered me. Forgive me. I am in his debt. You know, Dan, I know firefighters do incredible work all of the time, but this was exceeded anything that I can imagine. He threw me into a wall, covered me with his body. I could feel his heart banging against my back. We were both so sure we were going to die. The flame somehow stopped short of us. But whatever collapsed created, and you saw it in some of that video, Dan, a rain of cinders so thick that you couldn't see this far in front of you and you couldn't breathe. A police officer, and I wish I knew the firefighter's name, a police officer by the name of Brendan Duke grabbed my hand, and he and I tried to find our way through it until we could hit a clearing in the light. What you're seeing on the ground here, Dan, was in the air, and you couldn't see. And again, we thought we were finished. We somehow got to the light. Another firefighter gave me his mask for a moment so I could breathe. And then I made my way somehow through the smoke into the light to our crews. There was a cameraman there whose head was bloody, and he was trying to shoot and set up some of these shots there. The firefighters, the police, the crews, the people streamed toward me as I made my way to the Trade Center, sobbing and crying and trying to call home on dead cell phones, but they couldn't get through. There is so much fear out there even now because of gas main leaks. There was a point at which I watched firefighters run. Someone threw me forward. A paramedic truck let me jump inside and drove me halfway, and then a New York City bus driver opened his doors of an empty bus and drove me here to the broadcast center. To all of them, I mean, citizens of New York and have remained amazingly calm but deeply frightened.
CBS News correspondent Carol Marin, still covered with the smoke and pieces of the debris. Stick with us here, Carol. I want to repeat that New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani now says, and this is a direct quote, there have been a tremendous number of lives lost. Certainly no one at this early hour can know how many lives have been lost. But it's impossible to watch the pictures of both of the World Trade Centers collapsing. Keep in mind, these buildings were 110 stories in height each, with 50,000 plus people generally working there on a weekday, which this, of course, is. So when the mayor of New York says there's been a tremendous number of lives lost, there's no question that it is true. Carol Maureen, did you see any bodies? Did you see anyone that you said to yourself, that person is dead?
I saw people on stretchers that I was certain were dead. I saw firefighters and paramedics going into buildings where they themselves had to wonder if they were coming out. But there were a surprising number of people ambulatory and making their way out. I saw much more of that than I saw actual carnage. The concern that I heard from police and fire was that the people who were dead didn't make their way out of those towers, that most of the death is contained within those buildings.
And perhaps some people still alive inside the building. That frequently happens when by earthquake or something else has been a collapse such as this. But mark it, this is unprecedented. There has never been anything like this. The twin towers of the World Trade Centers collapsing, 4 airplanes hijacked within the space of an hour and a half or 2 hours, an apparent attack by air, plane crashing near Camp David. Details on that are still sketchy, and there's some question as to if a plane crashed there, how close it actually got to Camp David. President Bush on his way, presumably back to Washington. The White House has air fighter cover and has had such since the first reports of the World Trade Center attacks. President Bush says it's an apparent terrorist attack. It's clear that one of the suspects in this is the worldwide, what has been described as the worldwide terrorist network of Osama bin Laden. However, let us mark well that nobody knows who's responsible for these apparently coordinated attacks on selected targets in America today. That out of London, a Saudi dissident who is connected with Osama bin Laden pointed out today, this is Mr. Abdel Bari Atwan, editor of a London-based Arabic newspaper, said, and I quote him, Islamic fundamentalists led by bin Laden were, quote, almost certainly behind the attack on the World Trade Center in New York. This is this one man's opinion. This man, who is well connected with Osama bin Laden, says it is most likely the work of Islamic fundamentalists. Osama bin Laden warned 3 weeks ago that he would attack American interests in an unprecedented attack, a very big one. Atwan told Reuters, and he said that he personally received information that Osama bin Laden was planning very, very big attacks against American interests, unquote. Now, those are the quotes of one man in London. We want to underscore, italicize, put in all caps, nobody knows who's responsible for these attacks. Osama bin Laden gets blamed for almost everything in the way of this kind of attack around the world. There's been considerable controversy and debate in the upper reaches of Western diplomacy and intelligence agencies about whether he alone is capable of pulling off these kinds of attacks. But all of that will be for later to sort out. Clearly, someone had coordinated attacks on these selected targets. Byron Pitts, our CBS News correspondent, is on the telephone from the tip of Manhattan. Byron.
Dan, we're about 3 blocks away from where the planes crashed into the buildings. Joining me now is a security officer in the World Financial Center who was there when the first plane struck the building. Sir, what can you tell us?
Okay, all I can tell you is that roughly at about 10 minutes to 9, I was in the lobby of one of the buildings of the World Financial Center when I heard a rumble. I went outside. I saw the first plane strike the side of the building. There was a lull. A fire started in the top of the World Trade Center building, and then about 5 minutes later, a second plane struck. Debris everywhere. People jumping out of windows of the World Trade Center trying to save themselves. Literally jumping to their deaths.
Did you have the opportunity at all to evacuate some of the floors in the building you were in?
Yes, we did. Quick thinking of our forces there, decided to get everybody out as quick as possible after the first plane struck. That little lull period before the second one came helped us greatly in getting thousands of people out of one of our buildings.
Did you actually see the plane strike the building?
I saw the second plane strike the side of the building because I was outside evacuating employees from our building at that time. That was when we witnessed people jump into their deaths literally from the side of the World Trade Center building while it was engulfed in flames.
You were saying you've been near the scene recently. What was the situation?
The situation there was that about 15 to 20 minutes later, the structure that was remaining of the World Trade Center buildings caved in and fell straight to the ground, literally covering everybody that was within a quarter-mile radius of that building, myself included. Was stuck in the lobby area until the fire department came and got me out.
You were saying that I've heard you on the radio talking to some of your colleagues. What's the latest information you're getting from the scene?
The latest information right now is that we have major gas leaks in that area, and they're making the area totally sterile around the World Trade Center and the World Financial Center area due to these gas leaks, because we've been having mini explosions happening from underneath because of all the carnage.
Can you get an explanation as to why cell phones in this area aren't working right now?
I can tell you the reason why a lot of the phones aren't working, and that's because the main transmission site that was on top of the World Trade Center controls a lot of those phones, and obviously it's no longer there, therefore eliminating cell phone coverages for quite a few people.
Everybody who was near you, all those people got away, yes, safely?
Most of them did, sir. Some of them didn't. A lot of emergency service personnel were also injured. Obviously, there are casualties also. A lot of media trucks, a few of them were damaged also, as well as NYPD and fire department vehicles who could not evacuate the area in time when the two towers came down to the ground.
You said you'd seen this kind of thing when you lived overseas. Tell me about that.
I happened to be in Europe and England back in 1993 when the IRA had struck Camden Town with a bomb. There was a lot of carnage there. The IRA, as you know from past history, do a lot of this kind of thing in mainland England. But I can tell you, sir, that there has never, ever, in my witness of anything like this, being in this business for a long time, have I witnessed anything as to what I've seen today in mainland New York City.
Thank you, sir. The gentleman's a security officer in the World Financial Center. Dan, I'm going to pass the phone on to my colleague, Mika Brzezinski, who has another eyewitness. We've been held up in PS 89 Elementary School, a few blocks from the building, and grabbing people as they come by. Here's Mika.
Yeah, and Byron, one note on PS 89. I just spoke to the head custodian here, and he says for emergency workers or anybody in the area, there is water and food available here. Dan, I know you have new information. I'll send it back to you.
Thank you very much. Mika Brzezinski and Byron Pitts on the scene where the World Trade Centers have collapsed. We want to put up again for you, if we can, the airlines have confirmed that 4 aircraft were hijacked this morning, and the information on that, we're coming up to the top of the hour, we'll have as we go through the top of the hour. But it's noon in New York, just over 3 hours now since the first plane crashed into the first Good
afternoon, everyone. We interrupt CBS coverage to bring you an abbreviated version of Midday as we monitor the tragic events going on around the nation. As you've heard, there have been a number of explosions and plane crashes. Right now, they're all being attributed to terrorist attacks. If there are any new developments, we will go back to CBS for complete coverage.
And we do have word this afternoon that Governor Bush has evacuated the Florida Capitol. I believe we have some pictures right now that we can show you. The Capitol, again, has been shut down and evacuated as a precaution. We are also told that the federal building downtown in Tallahassee has also has some heightened security right now. They're trying to protect that and make sure there are no attacks on that at this hour. Leon County offices, we are told, and the courthouse are also shut down as well. And we have some video of the federal building as well downtown, if we can show that. There we go.
Okay, there are a number of closings this afternoon. Leon County offices and the courthouse are shut down, and the Florida Capitol, as we just mentioned. Schools are open except for Temple Israel. They have shut down their school. Leon County schools are on a heightened sense of alert, but parents can pick their children up if they can. School is not being evacuated in those areas. We
do have word that FSU and FAMU classes for those two have been canceled. TCC, we do not have word on that yet, or Valdosta State University, we don't have word on that. But FSU and TCC classes have been shut down, and as well as sporting activities for FSU tonight. We are just told TCC is still open today. We've just been told that.
Correct. We'll bring you further information when it becomes available. We do have some numbers. If you are worried about friends or loved ones in the areas that have been targeted, the American Red Cross has set up phone numbers for inquiries: 205-6099, 205-6100, excuse me, 6100 are the last digits. That will get you a line to the Red Cross. They will try to find out the answers to your inquiries, since phone lines are jammed in those areas that are devastated at this time.
Okay, and we are told that the figures there will be updated for the Red Cross at 12:30. Well, here is a look at when today's terrible events happened. At about 8:45, a first plane plowed into the World Trade Center. A second plane hits the second tower minutes later. President Bush calls the crashes an apparent terrorist attack. Just before 10 o'clock, another plane crashes near the Pentagon, hitting a helicopter pad nearby.
Just after 10 a.m., one Trade Center tower collapses. About 30 minutes later, the second comes down, and about an hour ago, word comes down that another had also come down. We will have another update for you at 12:30. We'll have the latest information for you, so stay tuned and keep it tuned here for the latest developments.
All right, now back to CBS.
Came down. And then as that awful fact was being absorbed, the second World Trade Center collapsed. Witnesses below screamed. Some were caught in the avalanche of cascading debris, concrete and steel. The mayor of New York says there'll be a tremendous loss of life. A police spokesman, speaking anonymously, said many thousands have died. In Washington, where the Pentagon, an aircraft came down at or near the Pentagon. Another aircraft reported crashing near Camp David, the presidential retreat. There's some doubt about what the facts are in that situation. To get a live picture at the Pentagon now, to sort out some of what's happened in Washington, we go to CBS News correspondent Bob Orr. Bob?
Well, Dan, the pictures are just overwhelming, and frankly, the people I deal with on a daily basis are not really prepared to deal with the depth of the devastation. As we look at the Pentagon picture here, I can tell you that I just spoke to the FAA a short time ago, and they are now confirming what other agencies have said for a while, that at least 4 large commercial airliners have been involved in today's attack, and there may be a 5th. We know, we've been putting the information on the screen, that there are at least 2 large passenger jets from United Airlines and 2 others from American Airlines. And to give people a firm grasp of this, each of these planes, as you see the flights now listed on the screen, each of these planes is the equivalent of a flying bomb. These are large airplanes, 757s, 767s. There's a terrible human component here. The 757 can carry about 240, 250 people. The 767, depending on the configuration, even more than that. So we're talking about the possibility of 800 to 1,000 people just on the airplanes. Each of the airplanes also is heavily loaded with fuel. I don't know, because we don't have the manifest, how much fuel was on each plane, but it's a reasonable guess. It could be 15,000 pounds, maybe 20,000 pounds. There's a tremendous heat source, a tremendous force, and you can imagine, and we saw in the pictures, just how devastating that is. When one of these planes crashes anywhere in the world, it's a catastrophe of a major proportion. To know that 4 now have crashed, and in populated areas, and apparently as the result of a deliberate act, really is an act that describes any, or escapes any kind of description. The FAA is a little hesitant with the information today because, frankly, the shots are being called from higher up. The White House, National Security Council, and the FEMA emergency response people are all giving the marching orders. It's going to be some time before we know how many people were on the planes, where the flight crews were from. We know where they were flying to and from, but before we know anything about the human side of this. And then the big question is, how could it happen? How could presumably terrorists of any sort, hijackers, take over 4 commercial airline planes all in a very, very compacted period of time? It's an indictment of the Federal Aviation Administration security system, and it is one that will have far-reaching implications. And beyond that, Dan, it's now also shutting down the entire aviation system. It seems to be a secondary point when we're talking about devastation that's large and the number of lives that obviously have been lost. But for the first time in the nation's history, the entire commercial aviation system is shut down. And in speaking to a couple of authorities this morning, I'm not all that certain it will be up and running again tomorrow. So this has really hit at the heart of America, at the heart of our infrastructure, and it's paralyzed a system that, frankly, many people thought was impenetrable. Dan?
Well, Bob Orr, in Washington, be plenty of time to assess blame and where things need to tighten up, but when the question is asked, how could this happen in and around an airport, anybody who's been in an American airport in recent years would know how it could happen. That no matter what security measures were taken, just to look around your average airport would tell you that it had a lot of holes in the security, but all of that is for later on. NATO Secretary General George Robertson called today's attack, quote, an intolerable aggression against democracy. Secretary of State of the United States, the distinguished retired Army General Colin Powell, said to Latin American foreign ministers, he was in Peru, this is a, quote, terrible, terrible tragedy has befallen my nation, but it has befallen all of those who believe in democracy. What you're looking at live from the tip of Manhattan is a new face of war. You've heard talk about the terrorism, the war on terrorism, the war being waged by terrorism. Take a good look. This is what it's about. We've said for years that terrorism would soon be coming to America. It began coming here big time in the 1990s with the first attack on the World Trade Center and other terrorist attacks. There is a war. It's a 21st century kind of war. It's war by sneak attack, in this case a devastatingly effective one. We have some photographs of these photographs taken from above and from afar. It's almost impossible to conceive of the death and injury, the blood and the screams of the dying when you have a picture this far away. There is someone leaping, or perhaps in fear forced, you saw that body come down the side of the building. The second plane hit the other tower at this time, is our belief. I'm just going to let the pictures speak for themselves for a moment. Eerie, Dante-esque scenes such as this repeated over and over again this morning. That area of Manhattan, New York City, once occupied by the majestic World Trade Center buildings, an indescribable scene of death and destruction. Where it was real blood and real screams of the dying. People seen leaping or being forced out of the building at fairly high levels. And when those buildings collapsed, that concrete and steel that came crashing down covered a wide area, a horrific sequence of destruction. And then there's this strange event, perhaps series of events that happened in Pennsylvania. Russ Mitchell has details on that.
Dan, that's right. One of the planes that was hijacked this morning apparently crashed outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, near the Somerset County Airport. This was United Airlines Flight 93 traveling from Newark to San Francisco. United Airlines has now assigned a number for families of victims to call. That number is 800-932-8555. Again, that's 800-932-8555. That's the number for families of victims of United Flight 93, which was hijacked this morning. It was en route from Newark to San Francisco and crashed outside of Pittsburgh. And Dan, as you're right, we watched this. It's surreal. We were just talking about it in the newsroom. It's like watching a movie. It really is. Only, of course, it's not.